seen, in a way, what you guys have is a bit of an inside-outside team here. So at the time, Emma was working inside the minister's office and I was working outside with civil society. So why don't we start talking about what was going on inside the government and why you think the move to take on the big tech platforms occurred with such gusto?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think governments for about the past 10 years or more in Australia had been aware of the digital disruption that the platforms had caused the media industry. And I had come from a media company, several media companies, so I'd seen it firsthand, the sort of advertising revenue falling off a fiscal cliff and everyone going to Google and Facebook, partly because they had really easy technology that made advertising with them simpler than, say, with your traditional media companies. So government and the regulators in Australia had been grappling with this problem for quite some time. They had tried to sort of deal with it through various grant programs and funding schemes over that time, and they'd written a lot of papers about the solution. But it was Rod's work, the ACCC's work, that was commissioned by the government that really sort of triggered a different way of thinking about the problem, because prior to that, it had not been thought of as a competition policy problem. It had sometimes been considered through the copyright lens, and then other times as just this big behemoth that nobody really knew how to deal with. So I think he tackled it from that perspective, and by doing that work he did and identifying a bargaining power imbalance, he and the ACCC gave the government something completely different and something new, and a way to deal with this problem that had never previously been thought of. So as Rod said, and I don't want to rehash what Rod said, there was an initial phase of a voluntary code proposed. And I think everyone was optimistic that Google and Facebook would come to the table and work with the media companies. As Rod also said, it became quite apparent by about the March, April of 2020, when you may all recall we were at the start of the COVID pandemic. That sort of, I guess, shone a real light on the extent of the problem in the media sector. And when I was working in the minister's office, a lot of the publishers were coming to us very concerned about what their future would be and how could we help them. And at that point, as Rod said, we asked him how the progress was going with the voluntary codes. It was obvious it wasn't working, and that kind of triggered the introduction of the mandatory code and the process that Rod discussed that we went through. I guess I can just summarize quickly what it was like dealing with Google and Facebook while I was in government. It was tense, it was stressful, it was combative at times, and they were very reluctant to come to the table and work with government. They said they were, but it didn't feel that way to us at times. And what I would just reaffirm from what Rod said was super important, was that there was bipartisanship and there was a collective will and willingness of the publishers to support what we were trying to achieve. And when media speaks with one voice, I'd seen it previously when I worked in a media company, when all the media companies come together and support legislation, it tends to, lead to legislation being introduced. And we went through that very tricky phase when Facebook turned off news, but the government actually held their nerve and proceeded with the legislation. And I think that the thing I would say to all countries, and I spoke to the Canadians about it and actually wrote recently about this, it's really important that governments hold their nerve when it gets to the really pointy end of negotiating the final stages of legislation. And my final point is that you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The legislation you end up with may not be absolutely perfect, but if it delivers the outcome like the legislation did, then I think that's a good outcome, and it's done Australia very well in terms of support for journalism. So
thanks,
Pete,
Emma.
you.
Yeah, look, the other, I think there's three things for you to consider. The first is that this was not a proposal for a news media bargaining code alone. It was part of, as Rodney and Emma have said, a really substantial piece of public policy. If you download the report, it is not called the News Media Bargaining Code report. It's called the Digital Platforms Inquiry. It's about 600 pages long. So if you are struggling sleeping at night, you can definitely download it, but it's incredibly well written and incredibly thoroughly researched. It created the evidence base to make the key finding that when we talk about digital platforms, Facebook and Google, we are not talking about tech companies, we are talking about advertising monopolies. And the finding on the advertising monopoly was the trigger for our competition regulator to pass a series of recommendations. I think, Emma, there's 27 recommendations in all, of which the News Media Bargaining Code was just one. Now,
26,
you guys all work in the media, and you would know that if you were looking through 27 recommendations and one of them said, give more money to media companies, that's the one you'd like to get first cab off the rank as well. And it was definitely that it got to the front of the queue for raw politics, that the media is very influential in Australia, and one company in particular. But if it had just been a piece of policy sitting with the Minister's office, there was organised opposition from both Google and Facebook, who have got, Emma will tell you, teams of government relations people exerting whatever pressure they can. They were not going to give up this principle lightly, because the proposition in Rod's report was to regulate at a national level the way that the platforms operate, which is just something they have never really countenanced before. You know, they push back at everything. The third thing I would say is that, and I should say by background, the Australia Institute is an independent, although politically progressive think tank, and I run the Centre for Responsible Technology, which is a satellite of that. And the role we often play, both proposing policy, but also working with government to deliver the last mile of reform, which is really about working with civil society to support government moving forward, particularly in the face of the sort of organised corporate negotiations, one word, threats another, that was being carried out by the big platforms. So we were working with academics who had written on the issues and the power of big tech. We were working with activists who believe that the big tech platforms have too much power. And we were working with those groups to provide evidence input into the decision makers who would ultimately determine whether the laws would make their way through the parliament. And that was not uncontested. Obviously, a large tranche of civil society is suspicious of the media and didn't want to see more money, particularly going into Rupert Murdoch's pocket, and News Limited controls 70% of the Australian media, so they were clearly a major beneficiary of these laws. I think my view was that the challenge and the opportunity to get good regulation in place to limit the growing power of big tech was worth holding your nose for that. So we leaned in behind. I've never had such a good run in the media promoting a form of digital regulation as I had with this one, I must say. And like, the media used their power where they have got it to create part of the condition where there was an expectation of change. But it was very important, because at the end of the day, when Facebook closed down their services to Australia, they, as Rod said, they overreached and they closed a lot of other, not just news sites. They were closing access to that platform to domestic violence services, to the Weather Bureau during a time when the bushfires were just about to hit. So it was very important to hold public opinion behind the government taking on the platforms, because, as you would know, if a fight between big media and big tech, a lot of people will say, well, there's no good guy there. And a lot of people are more likely to be using their Facebook or their Google than they are to be consuming the media in these days. So, you know, ultimately the fight was a political one. It was over control. Good policy, political bipartisanship, and some efforts to organise civil society around the proposals, I think all were the three sort of bases on which the successful laws got through. The last point I'd make is that this is not a cure-all to the issues of big tech power. One of my disappointments has been that the media has not got behind, in Australia, has not got behind some of the other proposals like privacy law reform with the same fervour as they did behind the News Media Bargaining Code. And the other thing is that because the negotiations, formal designation of the platforms never actually happened under the code. So there were good deals that were struck for media companies and through Emma's work with smaller media players. But ultimately, the regulation hasn't occurred. It's more a leverage in the marketplace to facilitate the deals that have given our media companies significant resources. So it's a complex picture, and I think it'll play out differently in every jurisdiction. But I would say that don't just think about these laws as a transaction. It requires that good policy and public outreach as well.
I would agree with everything Peter just said. And I would really endorse the proposition that this is one lever that needs to be pulled, but it's the start of the conversation about how you protect journalism long-term. It's not the end. And I think that's really important that publishers think of it like that, and that governments also realise they've got a continuing role to play in supporting, media, public interest media, and because as it's been pointed out, it's very important for democracy. So I guess, Pete, are we happy to take questions, or would that be the best way?
We can start the questions.
Yeah, sure.
So thanks a lot, Peter and Emma. It was wonderful to hear your views. So the first thing we want to ask you is that see the playbook which Australia played was the first of its kind, and Google and Facebook and the entire big tech was not actually ready for it. Now all of them know that what's coming their way. So what kind of backlash do you expect in all the other places including India when it comes to the tea?
Well, I think we've seen it play out already in Canada, the threats to shut down news services, Facebook News, attempts, I think, by the platforms to garner the support of some groups of the media. So they've tried to do a kind of a divide and conquer thing with maybe small versus large publishers. That may well be happening in India. I'm not close enough to what's going on, but I suspect that could be happening. Certainly happening in Canada, from what I've heard from people on the ground there. That's probably using their financial muscle to help small publishers, and also this disinformation that I've heard, that they're saying that this kind of law will only help big publishers. It won't help small publishers. And we know that is not the case because of what we've seen in Australia. And, as has been mentioned, the work I did with some small publishers, and I can see Paul Thomas is on for speaking later. He also was responsible for that through Country Press. So it is possible for small publishers to be beneficiaries under the legislation. But I think Google and Facebook, I suppose, understandably, are scared about that, the replication of the code beyond, the shores of Australia. So they will be doing whatever they can to sort of mitigate the costs and investment that they feel they have to make. And because we're a fairly small country, and so if they play it out and extrapolate what's happened in Australia and think about India, that would give them a moment to pause, I expect. Same with the US, particularly.
The only other thing I'd say on that is that, and you guys are all storytellers, the first rule of political campaigning is to go problem solution. And I think a critical part of building the momentum in our country for this was for the media to articulate the challenges they were under through falling revenues, the cannibalization of advertising markets, the fact that there were news deserts opening up across Australia where there was no media coverage whatsoever in terms of local papers anymore. So if it is just asking for a compensation, you've really got to also make the case for what you're being compensated for and how that is not about you, it's about the public interest.
Thanks, Peter. But Peter, I have a question for you. You of course are well-known columnist of Guardian Australia. We've read that a lot of news outlets in Australia have managed to increase staff strength, especially in the journalism, thanks to positive COVID impact of the code on their revenues. Guardian, we've read that has increased about 50% of their staff strength after the code. So is that a significant example for media organizations across the world? What are your views on that?
Absolutely. I had a very interesting discussion with a senior journalist at one of our daily newspapers, the Sydney Morning Herald. And what the code has done is not just release the pressure valve and had more people hired, but it's changed the way news is being covered. He said to me, because we now have staff, we're no longer trying to file 2 or 3 stories a day to fill up the pages. We're now filing 2 or 3 stories a week, and we're running higher quality. We've got time to build a story. We're not just accepting media releases and re-topping them. We're actually doing our work again. And I thought that was, I hadn't seen that, because a lot of my work is working with organizations dealing with media, and I go, the journalists are so busy, just send them the whole story and they'll write it. And there's been a change in mood, at least in our major newspapers, because they now have staff. Guardian Australia is rolling out statewide and local reporting, which we have not seen since it started up in the country 10 years ago. So, and I think, and Emma can speak more to the smaller players, because she was central in securing their deals, but the shift of dynamic from worrying where the next cut's going to being able to plan how to actually deliver the purpose of the media, which is public interest journalism, has been the significant win, I think, of this code.
Yeah, I think as has been pointed out, there hasn't been any disclosure of specifics of where the funds went, and that's because of the existence of very tight non-disclosure agreements that Facebook and Google, or in my case with who I did a deal with Google, we were asked to sign, but it's the same situation for Facebook. I would also say, though, that some of the larger publishers are probably not that excited about sharing the details of their deals if they don't have to either. I think they view it as a commercial deal, as Rod described, and he obviously has views about not disclosing and that transparency isn't a missing piece, whereas in some other markets, they're starting to say that transparency should be much bigger because of the government intervention. I actually, I fall more on Rod's side, and I know it's not popular, but I don't think the transparency is that important. And if a media company has used some of the funds to pay down debt, that means that they are sustainable in future years, that doesn't bother me. That actually makes me feel happy that they won't fall over and they will continue to exist. So there might be some public outcry about people spending that money on paying down debt, but if that saves journalists' jobs, to me, that's achieved an outcome as well. In the case of my small publishers, as I said, I'm not able to tell you anything specific about the deals they receive because I'm under a strict non-disclosure agreement. But I can tell you that the funds they've received have been transformational to some of these businesses, that they've been able to invest in their businesses. They've been able to invest in journalism. They've been able to invest in new equipment. And Google, I would reinforce what Rod Sims said earlier. Google were actually terrific to deal with. We did have a few, bouts in the ring and rounds of, debating what the publishers should receive. But after 6 months, we were able to secure funding for all 24 of the publishers in the group. They were all very satisfied with what they got, and they're all putting the money they've received to good use. And I think that's a good outcome for them, and they will all survive. And that to me is incredibly important as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. There's one question just related to that has come from our audience, come from Jaideep Karnik. His question is that with this arbitration and the deal with big techs also in any way helped with the discrimination they reportedly do in the algorithms?
With the
Sorry, I missed that.
algorithms.
Did you
Oh,
see
the
any change in algorithm after this?
Yeah, one of the real sticking points in the negotiation was algorithmic transparency. I don't quite know where that ended up landing, Emma. I think it was something that the big tech companies managed to hold on to, was it?
No, they do have to disclose major. Look, I'm really having to remember back to the legislation, so I may not be completely right about this, so don't take all my word, but I'm pretty sure that they're required to disclose with a certain number of weeks' notice major algorithmic changes. But they did get that provision watered down in the legislation. That was one of the ones they were very concerned about, because they saw that as their kind of secret herbs and spices that is, integral to their business model.
Okay. One more question from from the audience, from Mr. Rajkumar Warrior. He's asked how to deal with non-transparency of collection made by Google, and how do we arrive at a number which can be said to be satisfactory? What if even if it had gone for arbitration?
It's so hard. This is the bit where Emma and I probably disagree, in that I think because the government intervened to protect our media, there should be some transparency, so it could guide what the next round of negotiations might look like. My belief is that the platforms paid a premium to Australian media companies to close the thing down, and I think they hoped that the rest of the world wouldn't be listening quite as hard as it has been. Emma, we think the number Rod uses is about, for Australia, where we've got a population of about, I'm going to say 28 million. 26 million, and we believe it's something like 250 million per year, there or thereabouts, for the media. We don't know, but so that's $10 per citizen. You do the sums for India, and good luck with that.
That would be a lot of, revenue for all of us, if you go per the, as per the population base.
Well, or the circulation base, I don't know. But because it's all commercial in confidence, it's very hard. And that was, I think, because if it had been designated and there was a dispute, there would have been that baseball arbitration where each side took their number and the ruling would be the most reasonable of those two numbers, and there would have been a benchmark. And you could, this conversation shows why the platforms were so desperate not to have that embedded in the law.